Now I'd like to welcome Mr. Colm Brady and Mr. Brian MacDonald from the National Federation of Group Water Schemes, and you've already made your submission, so the members have had copies of those. So now I invite the members to ask questions. Deputy Farrell first.
Thanks, Chairman, and can I welcome our guests, and thank you very much for making yourselves available today. I just want to make sort of 3 questions, and you can come back at the end of my remarks. I think the first point that I'd like to make is in relation to what constitutes excessive usage, because we all have our views on this, and I appreciate that the Commission for Energy Regulation will be tasked, or will be tasked no doubt, with the setting of what that figure will be. I know you specifically refer to it in your submission in terms of the importance of a dissuasive argument for those who are either prone to wasting water or even to determine whether persons are wasting water or not, and what your view would be in terms of the levels at which that should be set. The other question I have for you is in relation to the very obvious question of fairness, particularly to those who are providing their own water supplies, such as your groups across the country, who obviously provide a very significant saving to the Exchequer in the long term. It is most likely cheaper for yourselves to provide the water supply to your communities than it is for the state to do so in certain instances. Otherwise you wouldn't exist, I would argue. How do you square that circle, though? How do you deal with that basic inequality that there will be if the current arrangement is to be adopted through the expert report, in terms of those only paying for their excessive usage versus private group schemes such as yourselves, who will be paying a charge regardless? Now, I understand there is state subvention, and indeed that has been restored as of the suspension date to 2015 levels, I understand. And I know you're calling for additional subsidies, and indeed it's in the report, which is helpful, no doubt to yourself. But just your view on that. And the final remark that I had to make was, I mean, do you have or can you quantify, and you'll forgive me, I don't believe it was specifically referred to in your submission. I mean, is it, or has it been, or do you believe it's possible for private group schemes such as yourselves to provide the service that the state are providing in housing estates up and down the country cheaper than the state is providing it? And do you have a view in regards to how that is achieved? Because, you know, I'm sure you can appreciate, we have had the Commission, we have had Irish Water, we had New Era just before you, we've had the Department and their officials on numerous occasions over the last few years highlight the total cost of the provision of the water and wastewater network across the state. But all the while, there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands indeed, of people across the state who are already paying for their water system and their local community water services. And with very few exceptions, I have seen examples of, certainly in the advice that we've been provided with, excellence within the service that your bodies provide, no more so than the state provider. So I'm just wondering if you had a view in regards to the ongoing sustenance of the group schemes that you represent, and what your views would be.
Thanks, Deputy. And maybe, Chairman, if I deal with the second issue first on fairness, and what about inequality or equity in relation to, I presume you mean between Irish Water and other services providers and the group water scheme sector. Since the late 90s, and it would be in the submission, when domestic water charges were abandoned on the public water supplies, the group water scheme sector has been getting a subvention, which is a contribution towards the cost of the supply and treatment of domestic water services. So that has been in place since then. And group water schemes then assess, they come together as a group to assess their own individual costs, their overall costs. they assess what they can get through the subsidy, and then they agree among themselves as a group with the leadership of their committee of management or their board of directors as to what they are prepared to contribute directly towards the costs of their group water supply scheme. That subsidy has been reviewed a number of times since then, and we review it in conjunction in the partnership arrangement we have with the Department of Environment, as it has been up until now, the Department of Housing, Planning, Community and Local Governments. We reviewed that on behalf of the schemes with that department, and in all instances we've had a good relationship with the department, and to take our views into account, to take our costs into account, and that I have to say that review has always been an upward review, apart from the time that domestic water charges were reintroduced, when we had a reduction in that subsidy. So we would expect that whatever comes out of this process, whether it be a charge based on excessive usage or a charge based on a charge that's there currently but suspended, or no charge at all, we would expect to sit down with the department, and we have assurances from the department, and I presume all the people here would give us the same assurances insofar as whatever comes out of this committee would recommend. We've been given assurances that we'll get a review of that subsidy at that situation. Now, we have flagged, and we always would flag, additional charges that would have been arising since the last review back in 2008, and we do refer to some of those charges there. But again, we'd expect that those additional charges or those additional costs would be taken into account in any review. So, in relation to operation and maintenance costs, there's where the equity comes into it, and we would expect that equity will continue to apply through that process. In relation to capital, again, we in the group water scheme sector have been getting capital grants towards the capital costs of, well, firstly new group water schemes, and then upgrading old group water schemes. And the old group water schemes that I'm talking about were put in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And those group water schemes were in a mess, effectively, at the late 90s, and it was part of a European Court of Justice case. So grants always had been there for the group water scheme sector, but at that stage the grants were significantly increased, and a serious amount of work was done under that rural water programme, as it was, again in partnership with the department, the local authorities, through the National Rural Water Services Committee. So that work has been done, and I'd take on to say, without contradiction, that in fact the group water scheme sector at this stage, through that grant aid process, is probably in a better position from an infrastructural point of view than Irish Water is. And we all know that all of the reports that we've seen to date show that Irish Water is in need of serious investment in order to bring its infrastructure up to date. So we're ahead of the posse there, and I suppose it's through that grant aid that we've achieved that. Again, we would expect that grant aid will continue through the process if that level of support is there for Irish Water and their capital costs. Group water schemes contribute towards the costs, the capital costs of their group water scheme day one, and the capital costs of any improvements and replacement infrastructure. But it is a programme it's very focused on getting value for money and only replacing infrastructure where it's needed. And around all of that, the whole area, through that rural water programme, the whole area of metering came into play big time. Group water schemes themselves would have been a little bit, group water scheme committees of management would have been a little bit iffy about metering in the beginning, but through the process of metering, and I'm talking about individual meters on tens of thousands of group water schemes across hundreds of group water schemes, tens of thousands of members across hundreds of group water schemes right around the country. Through that metering process, it just became very evident immediately, and particularly when the charging mechanism or the contribution mechanism based on volume of usage, when that came in, it was quite clear that most of the excessive usage, if we want to call it excessive usage or leakage, whatever we want to call it, most of that was on, or a very high proportion of it was on the consumer side of the meter. So through that, the usage came down, the demand came down, and as well as that, the amount of infrastructure that was required, such as reservoir storage. We have instances where reservoirs that were planned the projects could actually be abandoned because of the reduction in usage. So that was one of the savings there, and the saving in relation to operation and maintenance costs. Obviously, the more water you're putting through a system, the more maintenance is required. So that has come about through all of that. And group water schemes would say, from without contradiction from any group water scheme, that the metering and universal metering as a management tool and as a water conservation tool on their group water schemes, combined with a reasonable charge on usage over and above a free allowance, that has been the single driving force behind the overall transformation of the sector. So that was fairness. Excessive usage, what it constitutes. Our research on the group water scheme sector, and we can only deal with the thousands of members on group water schemes that we talk about. Our research would be that the average usage on a household would range from about 120 to 150 cubic metres per annum, and that would be based on metered usage, and metered usage in the context of metered water charge over a particular free allowance.
Sorry, Mr. Brady, to interrupt you, and it's really valuable stuff you're giving us. That's why I've let you roll on for over 10 minutes. But I really also want to give others an opportunity to come in, if I may. Okay. So if you could keep the answers really as tight as possible. We only have less than half an hour left. I didn't
even realise those 10 minutes.
I just come in on the issue of the sustainability, and I think it's a very good question. We do have still issues to resolve. You know, we've a lot of very small rural water supplies out there, and I suppose again working with the department, we do very much a partnership approach. It's actually 20 years ago this month since the collaborative approach, the subsidy arrangements were made with the group water scheme, and one of the major focuses of the Federation in the time ahead is to ensure sustainability, and we have a process of rationalisation that has begun within the sector. We're not content with being as good as Irish Water. We want to be better than them, and I think that there's evidence out there that a lot of schemes have actually attained that, and we're going to continue.
Okay, I want to go ahead with Deputy Colm, if I may.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to the group for making the presentation. It was most impressive and most useful, and you know, the main recommendation of the Expert Commission and the duty of this committee thereafter to seek to find a funding mechanism to deal with the implementation of that. In recommending the state become the main customer in relation to provision of domestic use, it also, to inform Deputy Farr, also recommends and asks that we seek greater parity and greater equality in relation to the likes of yourselves who fund that from your own resources, in addition to state help and assistance. I think that point has to be made, and that's our duty, and that's what we want to do, and that's what we want to get some information from you that allows us to be in a position to make a recommendation that can close that gap that hasn't been closed in recent years, I would add. So, to help us do that, I have some specific questions. Have you calculated, or did the Federation calculated, the estimated cost per household of a group water scheme bill? So the average bill, in other words, throughout the country. Have you calculated that, and can you make it available to the committee? Secondly, how much would complete subsidisation of group water schemes cost per annum to equalise completely with the public provision? So how much would it cost for complete subsidisation? And then what's the average subsidy per group scheme presently from the state? And how does that equate to the customer, to the end user? So in other words, what's the average subsidisation to each user? Same as, you know, we will end up with subsidisation if we proceed along the road in relation to public supply, and we need to compare that with the existing subsidisation that's taking place to the rural sector, so as that we can seek to address parity if necessary. And also, you know, can you tell us or inform us the agreement we reached with Fine Gael in putting a pathway in place in order to deal with this issue and allow government to continue to function so to deal with many other pressing issues, as we've seen last night, for example. But can you confirm that the grant aid has been reinstated when we suspended charges, and has it increased? Because there was a commitment given that it would increase, and we need to know that as authors of that agreement, in order to ensure that we were seeking, at that time even, to ensure that there was greater parity and equality. But there's a greater responsibility on this committee now, in the event of it making a recommendation to the Dáil and ultimately accepted by the Dáil, that there is greater parity and equality, and that is a responsibility of this committee and each member of it.
Just in relation to the final point there, Deputy, that confirmed the grant aid was reinstated. Yeah, I think I mentioned in my submission there that the basic rate of subsidy, there's two different types of schemes. There's schemes that get the water from Irish Water and the schemes that produce, treat and supply their own water. So the schemes that were getting the water from Irish Water, the subsidy prior to the introduction of charges was €70 per household, and this reduced to €40 per household from the 1st of January 15 when the water charges were introduced on domestic water supplies and Irish Water.
Less equality and parity.
So no, it was reduced at that stage when the charges were introduced. Yeah. And subsequent to the charges being suspended, it was brought back up to the same level again. It was the same for the privately sourced group water schemes, with the basic subsidy being 140, reduced to 95 and restored to 140. So they have been restored in full from the 1st of January 2016. In relation to the capital grant aid, the capital grant aid, the max limits on capital grant aid, if I could just refer to my notes here, capital grant 7,650, which is the current capital. That has been increased by €1,000 for existing group water schemes. It had been increased by €1,000 for new group water schemes possibly 2 years ago, but in the last 12 months it has been increased by €1,000. But that's a cap. I mean, you don't get €7,650 unless your cost of your project is over the full cost of 9,000 per household, and you make your contribution.
9,000
per household, and you make your contribution of 15% for the scheme towards those costs. That's where the 7,650 comes from. But that is, yes, an increase in capital grant aid in that situation. In relation to subsidy costs per annum, well, I haven't got the calculations, and the subsidy including the costs of administration on the local authority side of the subsidy and the rural water programme, and some other minor elements of that. I think the subsidy, overall subsidy for the group water scheme sector in the year is about 21 to 22 million euro.
I just come in there because I just have some facts here that might be helpful.
Sorry.
The operating cost subsidy in 2015 was 19 million, okay, I understand, and the capital grants in 2015 was 11.5 million.
Okay,
for the year.
We need to be able to drill right down here. You get the average group scheme, the average subvention, and knowing the average bill, we want the average subvention into each household that is within that. Well, that's information. If you haven't today, that's no problem. But the committee would like to have.
Well, as much as I can say is that the schemes, the subsidy, as I've said, the subsidy for schemes that get the water from Irish Water is €70 per household. That's what the subsidy is. As well as that, they get an allowance from Irish Water of usage that they're not charged for, because.
Have you quantified the value of that?
Well, it's 200. It ranges from, I think it's from 140, depending on the local authority area, to 227 cubes per house per annum.
So we need to be able to qualify and see as plainly as we possibly can.
Yeah, but just to
the
give
cost of a public supply, the cost of a private supply,
but just give the background.
The impression is that there's greater disparity than there might be. So. Yeah,
but the background to that allowance from Irish Water is that the group water schemes don't have to then meet the cost of treating and pumping that water. So that's part subsidy. Yeah.
Sorry, could you come back to us with just written answers to those questions, which are obviously very important for the committee?
We will as far as we can, but you have to understand that there's a whole range of group water schemes, from 10 house schemes right up to, I think the biggest scheme in the country is about 1,800 houses.
Yeah.
So the average we get will be a very, very average figure. It won't really bear any relevance to most of the group water schemes, but we'll get it and we'll outline the background to it. And
the average bill per household, how much it will cost for complete subsidisation, average subsidy for each user at present, and
with the add-ons on top of the 70. I recognise the 70, but there are add-ons that you've mentioned that haven't been quantified and haven't been costed and haven't had actual figures on them.
You're talking about the average subsidy, the average bill, and the average.
The average bill, how much would it cost for complete subsidisation, and the average subsidy for each user at present?
Yeah.
And,
Much the state is paying. Much the state is paying
paying
that household,
Yeah.
same as it's going to pay in a public
That's grand. And then I think the estimated cost, yeah, well, that's the same question.
Okay.
So that's all that.
Are we okay, Deputy? Can I
Yeah, that's
go ahead?
fine, thanks.
Okay. Deputy O'Brien.
Thank you. I'm happy for these questions to be added to the written replies if that's necessary. But just to also emphasise, whatever the outcome of this committee, there has to be absolute parity between those in group or private water schemes and those not in. And I suppose that's probably the priority for all of us in this particular discussion. One of the things I was interested in asking, and again a written response is fine, is the gap between the subvention and the actual cost. So if the subvention is €70 per household, what is the total cost of the scheme, or what's the difference?
I think that's the same
Exactly,
question.
so that's just to emphasise that. Likewise with the capital grants, one of the things I'd be interested to know is, if I have a constituent in a large urban area of Dublin and they build their own home, there is a cost to them for connection to the water mains, and currently they have to pay the local authority and they have to pay Irish Water, and those costs are now increasing. So in Dublin County Council, it's now €3,000, €4,000, sometimes €5,000 that they have to pay as part of the thing. So I'm interested again in your detailed response in writing to kind of give us more information about what kinds of works those capital grants go towards. What do they cover, what do they not cover, to try and allow us to make a comparison between the capital costs for a household in rural Ireland in a group water scheme versus those in an urban area. Your submission also talked about the reduction in consumption, in some cases between 60 and 80%. I'd be interested to know, was that as a result of the detection of leaks, whether that's inside the private property or not, or a change in behaviour and a reduction in usage, if you have any data on that? And then the last thing is those of us that are in the urban areas in Dublin, we still do have some group water schemes, and my own experience is some very much like being group water schemes and don't want that to change. They want equity and parity with whatever the outcome is for others. But there are also group water schemes that I have dealings with who would prefer to be in the public water system. But the difficulty, of course, is the local authority historically wasn't able to fund that work. So in a sense, they're outside of the public water scheme, but not by choice. How reflective are those two experiences of your own affiliates? Is there a desire among some to retain their current position, but obviously to improve the funding of it? Do others want to be part of a public water scheme, or does that depend on the circumstances and the funding that would allow that?
I think for the most part, group water schemes would like to remain as group water schemes, where there are people prepared to do the work and manage those schemes on behalf of the members. There are quite a number of group water schemes that have made the decision or are awaiting making a decision to apply to be taken in charge by Irish Water as it is now under the terms of the Water Services Act. And we have worked with Irish Water and the Department, again, in a partnership way to develop protocols and procedures around all of that. And those protocols and procedures are as good as finalised at this stage, and work has started on taking over those schemes. Obviously, the schemes involved would like to move the thing forward quicker, and we would be working with, again, the Department of Irish Water to do that. Of course, funding comes into all of this. In relation to where the reduction in demand came from, it was a combination, obviously, of leakage and change in practices, but it was all down to the fact that whether they fixed the leak or changed their practices with the volumetric charging in place, they were going to have a cost. Even myself at home in my own situation came across a leak that I wouldn't have come across only for I had a meter in place. It could potentially have cost thousands over years, and because I knew it was going to do that, and because I was aware of the implications for the environment and every other thing, I made sure and fixed that leak. So that's the kind of experience we're coming across all the time in relation to. The other questions I think have been asked, and we can. I'll let Brian.
Just in the specifics of that, what we would reckon is that about half of the leakage of the water loss on any distribution main was found on the consumer side of the connection. Not quite half in some, more than half in others. Some schemes were pretty high, and there was very, very high usage. And I suppose the specific circumstances, as you'll see from the submission from the Federation, there is a lot more pipe work on a group water scheme comparatively per household than there is on Irish Water. So it was absolutely essential. Obviously, the bulk meter did a huge job in identifying sections of main, and the tendency on the local group scheme was to think, well, it's leaking like a sieve, let's replace the pipe work. But replacing the pipe wouldn't have actually solved the problem, because in addition to the pipe, most of the actual loss wasn't in the pipe at all. It was on the consumer's side of the connection, and we could not have got that without the individual meter, and that's, I suppose, why our experience is very much in favour. And we actually put this question to group scheme caretakers at a number of seminars we had lately. Of all of the technological advances you've had in recent years, which, in your view, has been the most significant? And without exception, they said it was the introduction of individual metering. So.
Okay, thank you. Can I go ahead to Deputy Murphy? We've only 15 minutes left, and we'll be as tight as possible, please.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot for the submission and coming in. I had a read of the Rural Water News, and there's an editorial in it that I think is actually very important, and there's something that's bolded by yourselves that I agree with very much, where it says to ignore the group water scheme subsidy arrangement introduced originally when public domestic water charges were abolished in the late 1990s, leads to a one-sided debate and to an unnecessary and unhelpful urban-rural division on the water issue. The good news is that advance payments of the restored subsidy rate have been paid out to schemes in mid-December by way of a supplementary payment. For me, that's very, very important, because obviously there has been an attempt to have this urban-rural divide, which isn't at all helpful. Those of us who campaigned against water charges are against water charges for everybody. So is it fair to say that the fortunes of those on group water schemes, in terms of the amount that they end up paying out of their own pocket, have fluctuated in line with those who are on the public water scheme? Not to a point of complete fairness, because I don't think there is, but from the point of view of when water charges were abolished, the subsidy was introduced. When water charges were reintroduced, the subsidy was cut, and when water charges were suspended, the subsidy was increased again. That your interests have fluctuated together with those who are on public water schemes.
Okay. Well, I think that it's actually true, and there was a tendency, maybe following the report of the expert panel, to present this image of the group water scheme as victims in this, and we don't see ourselves as victims, because we do see that the subsidy introduced by, and we have worked under various ministers of various parties, and the department consistently has been a huge boon to the scheme, and that wasn't being reflected in the commentary that was coming out immediately after the report of the expert panel. So, I think that all sides of the House do recognise that the schemes are doing the job. The subsidy on the group water scheme is, of course, predicated on the existence of free water, if you like, as they call it, on the public side. So we don't take issue with that there. We don't take issue with the recommendation that it might be financed through the public exchequer. Clearly, from the point of view of our subsidy requirements, and schemes couldn't function without subsidy. A lot of schemes couldn't at present function without subsidy. So it is important to us, but we have to come back to what Colm mentioned earlier, is the relationship we have with the department. We total confidence, because over the years we've had a partnership arrangement developed where the concerns of the group water scheme sector have been reflected, and we do see a reflection in what's happening on the public side being reflected and we also, and I might add, in the review of subsidy in 2013, there were a set of principles agreed. And we would certainly be up to submitting those principles apart. And within those principles is the principle that equity will always be maintained for the group water scheme sector. So we're very, very confident that the House will reflect that.
No, that's very helpful. Just to follow up on that exactly, and it relates to some of the questions that have already been asked. I mean, for me, I think if we arrive at a position whereby those who are on Irish Water don't have any charges, well, then we need to mean, at least in terms of current expenditure as opposed to capital, those on group water schemes end up with no charges from their own pockets. And part of, I think, Deputy Cowan's questions were about figuring out how much that would cost. So I think the question's about what's the average bill for someone. That's very, very important.
But that's
just empirically, right? Could I just ask the question? I've heard empirically from people that an average charge people are left with after the subsidy might be around €100, €120 or €140, something like that. I'd ask, is that in the right ballpark? And then in that case, if the subsidies were doubled at a cost of €25 million, you're probably in the ballpark of eliminating current charges for people. But just empirically, your experience on that.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll come back to you. We'll come back to you on the average charges as much as we can say, because we don't have the figures to hand, and I don't want to mention a figure. But in relation to eliminating charges, I can't see the group water scheme sector, in fairness, come back to not having a direct contribution from their members and the members coming together and agreeing that on the basis of usage because of the success of that model up until now. So I don't see that happening in the future. I stand to be corrected in the future on it, but I don't see it happening. But certainly, I mean, a subsidy, you're right, a doubling of the subsidy obviously means an extra 22 million from the Exchequer into the group water scheme sector. But just Brian did mention the conditions or the arrangements that are there, the principles. I'll just summarise them very quickly. Fair treatment between drinking water consumers in the public and group water sectors, recognition of particular cost structures in relation to the extent of networks, subsidies continuing to be tied to conditions which support customer charters, compliance and optimal management, ensuring the combination of capital grants and operational subvention provides schemes with the capacity to sustain drinking water quality improvements. Arrangements are as straightforward as possible, recognising the scale of the sector and promoting water conservation and source protection. So they're the principles, and we're confident, again, as Brian says, that those principles will again apply in any review of subsidy that comes into place. And parity and equity, that's what our organisation was founded on back in 1997 for the sector, and we have fought for that. We have worked with the department on that. We've worked with 7 successive governments and ministers on that. We have been very successful. We expect to continue with that success, and we're delighted to see the expert commission recognising that. And we're delighted with the feel we're getting from this committee today that year about having that equity in place and that parity in place. We'll respond to your questions. Maybe if we can get those in some kind of written form.
Secretariat on those questions.
Yeah.
Can I go, because I'm really caught on time. Thanks. There's another committee coming in here at 2 o'clock. Senator Coffey, you wanted to come in, and if I can, Deputy Pringle, I'll get you in if I can.
I do, and I'll be as brief as possible. First of all, on the metering, I have questions on it, but I do note what the delegates have said in regards to the success of metering in terms of group schemes and how it has reduced demand and contributed to conservation and sustainability. And I think that's something we should note carefully as a committee. Very briefly, and again I would agree with colleagues, that it is very important for our deliberations as a committee that we do get some understanding of a typical bill for a person on a group water scheme. Because if you are to be treated fair and equitable, as we all want to do now, and it's specifically stated as a stated recommendation in the expert commission, we need to get an understanding around those figures. But there will be a sense of realism about that, Chairman, in terms of what we recommend, in terms of how is that going to be subsidised by the state. And I think everybody here acknowledges the work that has been done by group water schemes in terms of supply, maintenance and treatment of your own water supplies, and that needs to be continuously sustained and subsidised. But we will have to come up with recommendations to the Oireachtas, to the Dáil, on how we can treat you fairly in conjunction with others on public water supply. So I think it's a very important point. I would ask you to come back, if you haven't averages, at least come back with typicals, yes, typical bills to us.
We can do that.
So, you know, can I ask the question in regards to, since the establishment of Irish Water, the taking in charge, have you seen much consolidation or taking in charge from your members? Has there been much? I'm from Waterford now, there's quite a substantial amount of individual schemes, and there has been consolidation.
Yeah, I think, Senator, I have referred to that already. Well, there's 2 consolidations. There's consolidations within the sector itself, whereby group water schemes have amalgamated, making bigger entities with better economies of scale and whatever else. I think what you're referring to is a consolidation with Irish Water and Irish Water. Yeah, group water schemes, particularly group water schemes that are supplied by Irish Water, many of them do consider asking Irish Water to take them in charge. And there is provision under the Water Services Act of 2007 that those group water schemes can apply.
Okay.
For
I'm going to be brief. You've answered me.
That's moving ahead now.
Okay, and we can get more information from Irish Water on the amount of schemes that have been consolidated.
Yeah.
I think we can extract that.
It really has only started in the last 12 months.
Okay, and I'm trying to get, is there an indication from your members, is there a preference that if it was possible to be consolidated or taken over, or do you prefer to continue as you have been?
Well, there's, as I said earlier in response to another question, it depends on the particular group water scheme. If there's people prepared to manage it on behalf of the scheme generally wants to stay as they are. others want to
Well, if
take
I
it
can
over.
give you an actual figure, there are about 200 schemes that have requested taking in charge, and I think that's the key issue, and that there's hopefully going to be progressed. There was a long lead-in period into it and getting everything, the ducks in a row, that there's liable to begin now, we hope, sooner than later, because a lot of those schemes are orphan schemes, as we call them. There's absolutely no committee of management. They're in a diabolical state. They're sometimes connected to one another. So there is a big job of work to do there, but the Federation has been working closely with Irish Water and with other stakeholders, including the department, to progress that as soon as possible.
Okay. Finally, and in terms of equity and fairness, I think no value, whatever Oireachtas committee will ever sit, will put a value on the time and voluntary effort that your members, your committee members, have put in over many years to the provision of water in your communities. And I think, I don't know how we can square that circle in terms of acknowledging the value of that input. And I think those, it's a pity that the Right to Water campaign weren't here today. They were invited by this committee and they failed to present their delegates. But it's a pity that they're not here to listen to the contributions that you have made to society in your communities.
Well, I think I'd have to agree with you, Senator, and it'd be wrong of us not to acknowledge that too, right across the country over 40, 50 years at this stage.
It's important to put it on the record of this House.
Group water schemes have worked in a voluntary capacity largely. But the other issue in relation to all of that, and it's somewhere where the charges can rise in group water schemes, is that in order to comply with the drinking water regulations, it's no longer sufficient to operate group water schemes in a voluntary capacity. There is need for professional, paid management and caretakers there to meet these, and we're working with the group water schemes. Again, we have a lot of management structures in place, and that's just one of the areas where there might be an increase in costs associated with that for operating.
Okay, Mr. Representative, I really want to give Deputy Pringle an opportunity to ask maybe one question anyway, last but not least.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. Sorry, I'd like to have a wee bit more time maybe to expand a wee bit on some of these questions. But would it not be true to say that prior to the introduction of the Rural Water Programme, the management on group water schemes would have been quite haphazard and varied significantly from scheme to scheme? You know, some schemes would have had paid staff who would have been actively managing the consumption in the scheme. Some schemes, quite a lot of schemes wouldn't have had any. So actually the figures in relation to consumption and stuff like that are quite skewed from the fact that really the only first active look at the consumption figures on schemes would have been in conjunction with the major capital investment under the Rural Water Programme.
Yes.
It would have been based on actual consumption on those particular schemes. But I take the point you made. Effectively, group water schemes from they were put in the ground day one. They were left to their own devices for the most part, and they were being funded entirely by the members of the group water schemes. The people who were operating those schemes done a serious job in the context of the resources they had available to them and the time they had available to them. And as I say, it was for the most part done voluntary, and very good volunteers. And volunteers can manage group water schemes very effectively. The only point I'm making is that the regulations and the public health issues that are there now in the regulations, it doesn't lend itself to continuing in that capacity into the future. But there'll always be a place for volunteers and group water schemes.
I'm not disputing the work or doing anything to denigrate the work that people did in a voluntary capacity in relation to group schemes. But the point I'm making is that we're not really comparing like with like, and the group water scheme sector has done a huge amount of work in actually improving the quality and the standard of water on their supplies. That comes back to just the information that you've been asked to provide in relation to the average cost of schemes and that there. I think it would be important for the work of the committee to actually link that to maybe the individual schemes and the type of treatment that's on the scheme, because many schemes would have simple disinfection, whereas other schemes would have quite detailed DAF plant, which would make different costs as well. So I think that would be useful for the committee if the average costs were actually tied into the type of treatment that is used in the scheme too, because it could present.
Yeah, I think that's a very valuable point. If you could add that to your submission when you do it. I need to, Mr. Brady and Mr. MacDonald, I want to thank you very much on behalf of the committee. Your presentation was absolutely first class, extremely helpful. I'll have to.
Can you refer those questions to us, please?
We will refer those questions to you, through Tom.
We are preparing a submission already on equity and fairness, so we can include it in that.
Absolutely. Okay, so the meeting is now adjourned, and the next meeting of the Joint Committee will be held tomorrow at 1:30, the 8th of February. Good meeting,